So far in 2021, we've seen the release of both the Sony 35mm f1.4 G Master and also the brand new Sigma 35mm f1.4 DG-DN, which means that the world of 35mm lenses for Sony E-mount cameras is getting pretty spicy. But now the problem we're faced with is that with so many awesome lenses to choose from, it's really quite hard to know which one you should pick. That's why today we're going to find out which is the best autofocus 35mm f1.4 lens for your Sony E-mount camera.
Onward to the test!
In today's test, from cheapest to most expensive, we have the Samyang 35mm f1.4 FE, the Sigma 35mm f1.4 DG HSM, and that's the old version, the brand new Sigma 35mm f1.4 DG-DN, the Sony 35mm f1.4 ZA Distagon Zeiss T Star, which immediately wins the award for most convoluted name, and finally the Sony 35mm f1.4 G Master. Oh, and I'm also going to throw in the Sigma 35mm f1.2 DG-DN as well, because it's kind of the oddball in the 35mm world, being the only f1.2 option currently available, and I guess f1.2 is close enough to f1.4 to include it part of our test, right? You agree? Good, we're all in agreement then. So as we've just seen, the Samyang is by far the cheapest lens, so it picks up an early point to gain the lead. Now, sticking with Samyang, although this lens is the cheapest option, this does unfortunately mean that it's fairly lacking in terms of features. On the lens body, there's a manual focus ring, but that's about it. So no MF to AF switch or weather sealing on this thing, though the metal and plastic build does feel fairly nice and solid. The older Sigma 35mm f1.4 is also pretty sparse in terms of features, but at least this lens has the excuse of being almost 10 years old. It has a metal and plastic build with both dust and splash proofing, including a rubber seal around the lens mount. On the other side, there's an MF to AF switch and a focus distance indicator, but that's about it. The new f1.4 lens from Sigma is slightly smaller and lighter than the old one and includes an array of modernized features. It's kept the high quality metal and plastic design as well as the manual MF to AF switch, but it's done away with the focus indicator window to include a customizable button. Sigma also states that the dust and splash proof design has been improved, and it also features a declickable manual aperture ring that can be locked into auto mode using a handy switch on the side. The Sony Zeiss has a metal design that includes weather sealing throughout the lens body, but rather oddly it doesn't include a rubber O-ring around the lens mount like the other weather sealed lenses do. On the lens body there's a declickable manual aperture ring, though it doesn't feature a MF to AF switch or a lock switch to keep it fixed into auto mode like the newer Sigma does. Onto the Sony G Master now, and putting it bluntly, this thing is beautiful. It has a weather sealed metal build, though it's still noticeably smaller and lighter than all of the other options. It includes an MF to AF switch, a customizable button, as well as a declickable manual aperture ring, though like the Sony Zeiss, there's again no lock switch to keep this fixed into auto mode. However, it does include a rubber O-ring around the lens mount for further protection from the elements. Finally, the Sigma f1.2 lens is an absolute hulk and is much bigger and heavier than the other lenses. Its metal build is both splash and dust proof with a rubber seal around the metal lens mount. On the lens barrel there's an MF to AF switch, a customizable button, and a declickable manual aperture ring, though there's no lock switch to keep this fixed into auto mode. Awarding points for build quality is super tricky in this round, as all of these lenses are honestly very nicely put together. Though this is a competition, so I have to be super critical here, and I think all of the lenses deserve a point in this round except the Samyang, as it has a noticeable lack of features and also no weather sealing, whilst all of the other lenses do provide at least some form of protection from the elements. When attaching these lenses to my full frame Sony A7 Mark III, all of them feel very well balanced, with the exception of the Sigma f1.2, which feels noticeably front heavy. The smaller size and weight of the Sony G Master just makes it an utter joy to use, and it is by far the nicest of the bunch to work with because of this. Now, as we've discussed, most of these lenses include a manual aperture ring, but it's not something that I personally find very useful, so I prefer to just keep this dial set to auto mode so that I can change the aperture settings using the back of my camera instead. However, the new Sigma 35mm f1.4 is the only lens to feature a lock switch to keep it fixed into auto mode. So this means that when I was shooting with the Sony Zeiss and also the Sigma f1.2, on occasion I would accidentally knock the aperture ring off from auto mode to some random other aperture value. This would then temporarily bring the shoot to a halt whilst I reset the aperture ring to auto mode and also dial in the aperture value I was previously shooting with using the back of my camera. And no, it doesn't just remember what aperture value you had set in previously. As soon as you switch it back to auto mode, it resets to f4 for some weird reason, so you have to go back and manually dial in the aperture you want all over again. Cool, cheers, thanks for that. Now on a shoot like this where I had basically all of the time in the world, this kind of thing isn't that much of a big deal, but if something like this happened in a high pressure situation, like if I was shooting a wedding for example, and I happened to miss a crucial shot because of this mistake, let's just say that it wouldn't just be the confetti I'd be throwing, it would be the lens directly into the nearest lake. The Sony G-Master also doesn't include a lock switch, but this is where this lens becomes the exception to the rule. Sony have rather smartly given this dial a ton of resistance between auto mode and the next aperture value, meaning that it's virtually impossible to accidentally knock it. Believe me, I've tried. You actually have to put a fair amount of force onto the dial to switch it away from auto mode. When switching over to manual focus, the Samyang, both of the Sigma f1.4s and the Sony G-Master were all super responsive and easy to use. The G-Master in particular has a super smooth action to it and was just a dream to focus with. The Sony Zeiss, however, was pretty inconsistent and made it really frustrating to perform even the most basic of focus pulls. Every time you rotate the dial, the endpoint will change depending on the speed of your rotation, making it tricky to build up any kind of muscle memory. The Sigma f1.2 had a very similar inconsistency issue, as well as a small amount of delay between your hand movements and the focus actually shifting. To make things worse, this dial has a monstrous amount of range as well, which means completing longer focus pulls can be quite uncomfortable and often requires rotating your wrist 180 degrees around the lens barrel. Anyway, when it comes to awarding points for handling, the new Sigma f1.4 and the Sony G-Master are by far my favourites of the bunch due to their lightweight and nice array of modern features. All of these lenses are compatible with my Sony a7 Mark III's IAF and face detect, and in terms of AF speed, they were all quick and accurate to focus. Though I've got to say that the AF on the Sony G-Master was by far the quickest to lock on focus. This thing is lightning quick. When shooting wide open in super low light conditions, although the AF speed for most of these lenses dropped slightly, none of them showed any signs of hunting, which is good news. As for shooting moving targets, for the most part, all of these lenses did a pretty good job, especially considering that these images was shot wide open. The Sigma f1.2 had the slightly tougher job, as its wider maximum aperture of f1.2 meant that it had the smallest area of sharp focus to work with, but even so, only one of the shots was marginally out of focus, with the rest being tack sharp. The Sony Zeiss was the only lens to produce any images that were significantly out of focus and unusable. So with all of that in mind, all of these lenses deserve a point, with the exception of the Sony Zeiss due to its less than perfect performance in the last test. Switching over to video mode, and whilst filming Georgia walking towards the camera at the lens's respective maximum apertures, all of the lenses were able to keep up, with the exception of the Samyang and the old Sigma f1.4, which both dropped focus a few times throughout the walk. When repeating this test at a faster pace, I gained the same results, with the Samyang and the old Sigma still struggling to keep up. Now, I've got to admit, the old Sigma's performance in this test did throw me a little bit, because I actually tested this exact lens last week in 2 videos, and in each video test it performed absolutely fine. However, after comparing this week's footage against last week's, I realised that in this new footage I had asked Georgia to end her walk much closer to the camera. And I also noticed that it's when forced to focus up close that the old Sigma starts to struggle, whereas at further distances the focus appears to keep up just fine. The Samyang, on the other hand, just struggles throughout the entire walk, no matter the distance. As for AF noise, the new Sigma f1.4 and the Sony G-Master don't make any noise at all. The other lenses are all still very quiet, though a subtle amount of motor noise was picked up by our camera's built-in microphone. The Samyang was the noisiest of the bunch, with a rather distracting clicking noise littering our camera's audio. Focus breathing is unfortunately a problem for all of these lenses, though both of the Sony lenses are definitely the worst offenders. They could actually pass for a zoom lens, the focus breathing is that bad. Focus breathing aside though, I'm going to award points to both of the Sonys, the new Sigma f1.4 and the Sigma f1.2 for their performances in this round. When it comes to bokeh, the Sigma f1.2 is the clear winner as it offers the smoothest and thickest blur of the bunch thanks to its wider maximum aperture. In my opinion, the rest of the lenses are all fairly closely matched, though I would go so far as to say that the Samyang produces slightly messy looking bokeh, whilst the old Sigma f1.4 would be my second place favourite, as the textured background in this image just appears to be much softer than the rest. As for bokeh balls, broadly speaking, the results are all fairly similar. Round orbs in the centre, turning more cat's eye shape as they get towards the edges. The Sigma f1.2 creates noticeably larger orbs thanks to its wider maximum aperture, though if I had to crown a winner for the best balls, then it would actually have to be the Samyang, as it produces the most consistently round orbs, closely followed by the new Sigma f1.4. So in this round, I'm going to give the point to the Sigma f1.2 as it produces the nicest bokeh overall. All of these lenses exhibit flaring, though the new Sigma f1.4 and the Sony G-Master are able to handle it slightly better than the rest. When shooting wide open at the lens's respective maximum apertures, all of the Sigma lenses and the Samyang display some barrel distortion at the edges, whilst the two Sony lenses feature pincushion distortion. At the centre, the Sony G-Master is by far the sharpest lens with superb contrast, with the Sigma f1.2 in second place and the Sony Zeiss in last place with the softest results. At the corners, the Sony G-Master is yet again the sharpest option, with the Sigma f1.2 in a close second place. Despite being pretty sharp at the centre, both the Samyang and the new Sigma are very soft and smudgy at the corners. At the minimum focusing distance, the results are pretty close, though the new Sigma f1.4 is noticeably softer than the rest. The Samyang displays a touch of red fringing, whilst the old Sigma f1.4, the new Sigma f1.4 and the Sony Zeiss all have a touch of purple and blue fringing. On our longitudinal chromatic aberration test, the Samyang and the new Sigma f1.4 displayed similar results, with significant blue fringing at the top, turning into amber at the bottom. The Zeiss starts off with teal fringing at the top, turning magenta towards the bottom, and the old Sigma has green fringing above the area of sharp focus, turning purple at the bottom. The Sigma f1.2 is actually the best performer here, closely followed by the G-Master, with only small hints of coloured fringing. Truth be told though, all of these lenses are capable of capturing lovely looking images, and the 35mm focal length is definitely one of my favourites for capturing candid looking portraits. None of these lenses create any noticeable colour cast, so this is good news for portrait work, as it means that skin tones remain true to life without the need for any tinkering in Lightroom. So at the end of this round, I'm going to give the final and winning point to the Sony G-Master, making it the deserving winner of our little contest here. However, I'm also going to give the Sigma f1.2 half a point, as it's a very, very close second place, so I feel like this lens needs to be rewarded for that. In conclusion, if you're dollar rich and you want a 35mm lens that gives you the best possible image quality and also AF performance in a beautifully crafted lightweight package, then the Sony G-Master is the one. However, if you're dollar rich and achieving the best bokeh is more your thing, then I would suggest getting the Sigma f1.2, because that's arguably the better option. Just make sure you spend a bit more time at the gym getting pumped before you buy this thing. Finally, if you're not really dollar rich, but you're more of a broke-ass bitch, then the new Sigma f1.4 is the best budget option within this class of lenses, offering a great array of features with decent image quality, just not up close, and solid AF performance to boot. So in today's lineup, from cheapest to most expensive, I almost dropped the mic. 1 second. Oh, f***ing hell. Nailed it. Perfect.